I wasn't even supposed to be there that day. That's the thing nobody tells you about moments that change you, they don't announce themselves. They don't send you a letter or tap you on the shoulder. They just happen. And you're standing there with a half-eaten sandwich in your hand and pigeons fighting over crumbs at your feet, and suddenly, the world does something it has never done before. My name doesn't matter for this story. What matters is that I was there. I was standing on the pavement outside Buckingham Palace on a Tuesday in late October, one of those days that can't decide what it wants to be. The sky was this bruised mix of gray and pale gold, like the sun was trying but losing. Wind came in these short, sharp gusts that made the tourist flag snap and flutter. It smelled like autumn leaves, exhaust fumes, and, somewhere in the distance, roasted chestnuts from a vendor cart parked near the Victoria Memorial. I'd come to London for work. A conference near Victoria. But my afternoon session had ended early, and my hotel was close enough to walk, and I thought, as you do, I'll just pass the palace. Just a quick look. I'd seen it before. Most people who visit London have. You come, you stare through the big iron gates, you watch the guards stand there like decorative statues carved from khaki and black fur, you take a photo, you leave. That's the routine. That's what everyone does. But that day was different before I even understood why. The crowd outside the palace gates was the usual October mix. Japanese tourists with expensive cameras on long straps. A school group from somewhere in the north of England, I could tell by the accents, the way the kids said right after every sentence. American couples in matching trainers. A few older gentlemen with those folded paper maps that nobody uses anymore, staring at them like they held the secrets of the universe. And, then, there were the guards. Two of them were visible from where I stood positioned at the sentry boxes, one on each side of the main gate. Bearskin hats. Red tunics. Rifles held perfectly vertical against their right shoulders. Faces absolutely, unnervingly blank. I've always been fascinated by the royal guards. Not in a tourist way. More in a how do you do that kind of way. How do you stand there while people shove their face 6 inches from yours and make stupid expressions? How do you hold your body like that for hours? How do you exist in a crowd while being somehow completely absent from it? I was thinking about all of that when I noticed him. The guard on the left. His name, I would learn much later, was Thomas Ashworth. 26 years old. 5 years in the household division. Son of a railway worker from Derbyshire. Not that any of that was visible on his face. Nothing was visible on his face. That was the whole point. But something about the way he was standing, something almost invisible, made me pay attention. It wasn't that he moved. He didn't. Not yet. It was more like the quality of his stillness changed. Like when you're in a quiet room and someone else enters, and the air shifts, and you know before you even turn around that something is different. At around 2:30, things started happening quickly. A convoy of black vehicles came around from the side road, that smooth, silent way royal motorcades move, like they're floating just slightly above the tarmac. Police outriders in front. Then, 2 dark Jaguar saloons. Then, a Range Rover at the back. The standard formation. The crowd immediately reacted. People pressed forward. Phones came out. The school kids surged toward the railing, and their teacher, a small, frantic woman with a yellow lanyard, started saying back, please in the exhausted voice of someone who has said it 100 times already today. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Is that her? Is that the Queen? Queen Consort. She's the Queen Consort. Same thing, isn't it? No, it's not. Actually, this is how people talk at palace gates. Like they're watching a nature documentary and narrating what they see. The vehicle slowed. The gate began to open, that slow, heavy swing that always looks like it takes effort, even though I'm sure the mechanism is perfectly engineered. An official in a dark suit appeared near the gatehouse, speaking quietly into a radio. And then, just for a moment, the rear window of the second Jaguar lowered slightly. I was maybe 30 meters away, at an angle. I couldn't see clearly. But I saw the shape of a face, pale and composed, looking out at the crowd with that particular expression that royals seem to practice, engaged but distant. Present but protected. Queen Camilla. Or someone very close to her. I was certain enough. What happened next began so quietly that most people missed the start of it. A man near the front of the crowd, standing right at the railing, started shouting. Not in a threatening way, exactly. But loudly. Insistently. The kind of shouting that has tears mixed into it, that comes from a place beyond ordinary anger. My mother wrote to you, he was saying. She wrote to you 3 times. 3 times and nobody answered. She just wanted someone to know he was maybe 50. Gray at his temples. Wearing a dark coat that was too thin for the weather. His hands were gripping the railing bars so hard his knuckles had gone white. He wasn't violent. He wasn't carrying anything. He was just a man who was breaking, and doing it in public, and unable to stop himself. The crowd reacted with that particular British awkwardness, stepping back slightly, looking away, performing the collective pretense that this wasn't happening. 2 police officers near the gatehouse started moving toward him. Not running. Walking with purpose, the way you do when you don't want to escalate, but you absolutely will if you have to. And the convoy, which had paused, as they do, began to move again. This is the part that matters. This is where Thomas Ashworth did something that Thomas Ashworth was absolutely, categorically not supposed to do. He moved. Not a dramatic lunge. Not a sprint. A step. One single step out of his sentry position. In the world of royal guards, that is not a small thing. That is an enormous thing. You don't step out of position. You don't break formation. You don't exist as a person with a body and a will when you are on duty at that gate. You are the uniform. You are the tradition. You are the living symbol of something ancient and immovable. You don't take a step. But Thomas Ashworth did. And then he took another. He walked, still upright, still with that military precision in every movement, his rifle still held correctly to the railing. To the man who was shouting. And he stopped in front of him. Not to block him. Not to restrain him. He just stood there. Facing him. Close enough to look him in the eye. The man with the gray temples stopped shouting. For a second I thought it was because he was surprised. Because everyone was surprised. I was surprised. The teacher with the yellow lanyard had stopped talking. The Japanese tourists had lowered their cameras. Even the pigeons seemed to pause. But then I saw it. Thomas Ashworth was speaking. Barely. Just his lips moving. Almost nothing. The quietest words you could say while still saying them. I couldn't hear it. Nobody could, really, except the man at the railing. Whatever it was, those few words, that slight tipping of the head, that look on the guard's face that was not the ceremonial blankness but something entirely human, it did something to the man with the gray temples that the shouting hadn't done and the approaching police officers hadn't done. The man's grip on the railing loosened. His shoulders dropped. His face crumpled. And he started to cry. I don't cry easily. I want to say that not to seem tough, but because it matters to the story. It matters because what I felt when I saw that man at the railing break down wasn't sadness, exactly. It was something closer to recognition. Like watching someone finally say a thing out loud that you'd felt for years but couldn't name. There's a particular kind of grief that comes from being ignored by something enormous and official. From sending letters that disappear into silence. From believing, because you were raised to believe, that if you just explained yourself clearly enough, if you found the right words, if you were respectful and patient and persistent, eventually someone with authority would hear you. And then, discovering that nobody is listening. That's what was on that man's face. Not madness. Not danger. Just the specific exhaustion of someone who has tried every proper channel and found each one blocked, and has finally come to stand outside the biggest, grandest gate he can find and scream into it because what else do you do? Where else do you go? I don't know his name. I still don't. But I know the shape of his pain, because I think a lot of us do. The two police officers had reached him by now, but they weren't touching him. They were standing slightly to the side, watching like they were as uncertain as the rest of us about what was actually happening here. Thomas Ashworth was still talking to him. Still barely. Still just that low murmur, that movement of lips, that lean at just a fraction toward the man on the other side of the bars. And here's the thing that I keep coming back to, even now, months later. He hadn't broken character to be heroic. He hadn't stepped forward to be noticed, or to make a moment, or because he calculated that this would go viral. There was nothing performative about it at all. In fact, he looked almost reluctant, like he'd had an internal argument with himself and lost, and stepping forward was the only honest thing left to do. That's the bit that stayed with me. The reluctance. Real bravery usually looks like reluctance. It doesn't look like confidence. It looks like someone doing a thing they know they'll probably get in trouble for, because the alternative, not doing it, sits worse with them. The convoy had stopped again. I noticed that second. It had started moving after the shouting began, and then it stopped. And it was still stopped. The Jaguars and the Range Rover were sitting at a strange angle in the courtyard, partway through the gate, like whoever was inside had said something to the driver. I looked at the window of the second Jaguar. It was still slightly open. A woman near me, a tourist, Italian I think, from the guidebook she'd been holding, grabbed her friend's arm. She'd noticed the same thing. The car wasn't moving. I want to be careful here, because I can only say what I saw. I can't tell you what decisions were being made inside that vehicle, or what words were spoken, or whether the person inside was watching what was happening at the gate or simply waiting for a radio clearance. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was protocol. But, from where I stood, it looked like someone was watching. It looked like someone had chosen not to look away. The man with the gray temples had his back mostly turned to the convoy by now. He'd stepped back from the railing, not far, just a small retreat, and he was talking to Thomas Ashworth through the bars in this halting, jagged way. Like words kept getting stuck in his throat. I was close enough now that I could catch fragments. She just wanted someone to acknowledge. 3 years, she wrote for 3 years. Nobody even sent a reply. I couldn't hear Ashworth's responses. His voice was too quiet. But I watched his face. And that was enough. He was listening. Not guard listening. Not the polite, rigid attention of someone performing concern because it's required. He was actually listening, eyes-focused, head slightly angled, with that quality of stillness that is completely different from the sentry stillness he'd been standing in 10 minutes ago. This stillness was chosen. This was the stillness of a person who has decided that what they're hearing matters. At some point he shifted his rifle, adjusted the hold slightly, almost unconsciously, and I remember thinking, he's forgetting he's holding it. He's so present in this conversation that the rest of his body is on autopilot. I don't know why that detail undid me as much as it did. The police officers were in a strange position. They'd been moving to manage a disturbance, and now there was no disturbance to manage. The man wasn't shouting. He wasn't threatening anyone. He was having a quiet conversation through a gate with a royal guard who technically should not be having conversations at all. One of the officers, younger, with close-cropped hair, glanced at his partner. His partner gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shrug. What do you do with that? Nobody in the rulebook wrote instructions for this. The crowd had shifted its energy too. Earlier, there'd been that nervous, performative ignoring, the way people collectively pretend an awkward thing isn't happening. Now it was something else. People were watching openly, but quietly. Nobody was filming. Or rather, a few people had their phones up, but most of them had put them away, like they'd decided without being asked that this wasn't something to record. That surprised me more than almost anything else. People put their phones down. At a royal event. In 2024. People chose to just watch with their eyes. That tells you something about the quality of what was happening in front of us. I don't know how long it lasted. Maybe 4 minutes. Maybe 6. Time does that thing when something real is happening, it stops being measurable in the ordinary way. What I know is that at some point, Thomas Ashworth reached into the small breast pocket of his tunic and produced something. Something small. A card, maybe, or a folded piece of paper. He pressed it through the bars of the gate. The man took it. He looked at it for a moment. Turned it over. Said something I couldn't hear. Ashworth responded. Nodded once, that precise, controlled military nod. And then, and I swear this is exactly how it happened, he straightened. Gradually. Like he was assembling himself back into the shape of the uniform. His face went back to that stillness. Not the cold blankness of ceremony, but something that took effort and decision. He took one step backward. Then, another. He returned to his sentry position. He stood exactly as he'd stood before. And if you had arrived at the gate at that exact moment, you would never have known anything had happened at all. The convoy began to move again almost immediately. That timing, I've turned it over in my mind so many times since. Whether it was coincidence. Whether the cars had simply been waiting for a radio all clear that happened to come at the same moment. Whether any of the right people even knew what had just occurred 10 meters from where their vehicles sat. I honestly don't know. What I know is what the woman with the Italian guidebook said to her friend as the Jaguars rolled through the gate. She said it quietly. In English, which surprised me, so she must have wanted me to hear it, or at least didn't mind if I did. She said, "Did you see his face? When he was talking to that man?" And her friend said, "Yes." And that was all. Neither of them said anything else. But they were both looking at the sentry box where Thomas Ashworth had returned to his post, and their expressions were the same. That particular softness people get when they've witnessed something true. The man with the gray temples stood at the railing for another minute or two after the convoy had disappeared inside. He held the card or paper, whatever it was, in both hands, carefully, like you'd hold a letter from someone you'd given up on hearing from. Then, he put it in the inside pocket of his coat. Close to his chest. He looked at the guard, at Ashworth, standing perfectly still in his box, for a long moment. Then, he walked away. Not hurrying. Not the frantic energy of before. Just walking. A man with somewhere to go and something new to carry. I watched him until he disappeared into the crowd near the Victoria Memorial. Then, I looked back at the gate. And Thomas Ashworth was exactly where he'd always been. Rifle vertical. Face still. Bearskin hat catching the gray October light. As if nothing at all had happened. As if everything in the world was exactly as it should be. Except that one of the police officers, the younger one with the close-cropped hair, had turned his back to the crowd for a moment. He was facing toward the palace railings, away from everyone. And his hand came up once, briefly, to his face. Could have been wiping his nose. I don't think it was. I went back the next day. I know how that sounds. Slightly obsessive. Slightly too much investment in a thing that, technically, had nothing to do with me. But, I went back. I told myself it was because I had another conference session near Victoria in the morning and it was on the way. And that was true. It was also completely beside the point. I went back because the thing I'd seen the day before had left a splinter in me. A good splinter, if there is such a thing. The kind of small, sharp detail that gets under your skin and refuses to leave until you've understood it properly. The morning was different from the afternoon before. Colder. A thin mist sitting on the grass of St. James's Park, burning off slowly in the pale sun. The rush hour crowd near the palace was thinner, a few early tourists, some joggers in fluorescent jackets, delivery cyclists cutting through on the road alongside the railings. I didn't know if Thomas Ashworth would be on duty. I didn't know his name yet, either. That came later. He wasn't there. Different guards. Same stillness, same uniform, same quality of stone-like presence. But, not him. I stood there for about 20 minutes, feeling slightly foolish, watching a school group arrive and organize themselves into a photograph. A little girl in a red coat kept breaking ranks and had to be retrieved by a frazzled teaching assistant. The guards didn't react. I was about to leave when a man approached me. 50s, maybe. Solid build going to softness. Wearing a high-visibility vest over a fleece, one of the park's maintenance staff, I assumed. He had a thermos tucked under one arm and the look of someone who'd seen this spot in every season and every light. "You were here yesterday afternoon," he said. Not a question. I said yes. He nodded slowly. "I was doing the bins near the memorial," he said. "Saw what happened." We stood in silence for a moment, which felt oddly companionable for two strangers. "Does this sort of thing happen often?" I asked. He took a sip from his thermos and looked at the gate. "People breaking down?" "More than you'd think." He paused. "Guards stepping out of position?" Another pause. "Never seen that before." "Not once." 22 years working near this place. He said it without drama. Just a fact. I started asking questions quietly, carefully, the way you do when you're afraid that pressing too hard will make a thing disappear. The park's worker, his name was Frank, which he offered without me asking, which is the friendliest possible thing a stranger can do, knew a reasonable amount about the guard rotation schedules from pure proximity and 22 years of observation. He knew the faces, the patterns, the rhythms of who stood where and when. He also knew some of the other staff around the palace periphery. Not all of them talked. But some of them did, especially to Frank, because Frank was the kind of man who was simply there, reliably, without agenda, and people forget to guard themselves around that type. What Frank had heard, and he was careful to present it as heard, not known, was that Thomas Ashworth had indeed been spoken to after the incident. Formally. By a superior officer. I asked what that meant. Whether he'd been reprimanded. Disciplined. Removed from duty. Frank took another slow sip from his thermos. "Way I heard it," he said, choosing his words like he was picking his way across wet stones, the conversation didn't go quite the way his superior expected it to go. I waited. Apparently, he just listened. Let the officer go through the whole thing. The breach of protocol, the stepping out of position, all of it. Sat there and heard it all. Frank paused. "And then," he said, "and this is exactly how I heard it, so I'm not adding anything," he said. The man had been trying to be heard for 3 years. I gave him 4 minutes. "I'll stand by that, sir." Frank looked at me. Then, he sat back and waited to find out what happened next. What happened next was the part one couldn't verify. Not through Frank. Not through anything I could find afterward with careful, cautious searching online. There are no news articles about Thomas Ashworth. No viral video that I could locate. No official palace statement. That absence of documentation is its own kind of answer. I think things that the palace wants to disappear very cleanly. But, Frank said, and, again, heard, not known, that it didn't go further than the immediate superior. That the commanding officer who received the report had simply let it sit. Not cleared it. Not erased it. Just made no further move. And, Frank said there was one more thing he'd heard, though he said this one even more carefully, the way you say something when you're not sure whether you should say it at all. He said someone from within the palace staff, not anyone Frank could identify, not anyone he'd spoken to directly, had apparently made a quiet inquiry about the man at the railing. About who he was. About what letters he'd sent and where they'd gone. That's all. Just a quiet inquiry. Whether anything came from it, Frank didn't know. I don't know either. But, when he said it, standing there in his high-vis vest with the mist still lifting off the grass, I felt something complicated move through my chest. The possibility, just the possibility, that the paper Thomas Ashworth had passed through the bars wasn't just a kind gesture. That it was something with an address on it. A number. A name. A door that wasn't the official front door, which everyone knows leads nowhere, but a side door that someone who knew the building had quietly identified. I don't know if that's what happened. I think it might be. I spent the rest of that morning in a coffee shop near Victoria Station, nursing an Americano and staring at my laptop without really working. I kept thinking about the nature of rules. We talk about rules like they're simple. Like they're either right or wrong, necessary or arbitrary, worth following or worth breaking. But most rules exist in this complicated middle space where they serve a genuine purpose 95% of the time and become something else entirely in the remaining 5%. Thomas Ashworth knew that. He'd trained for years to be part of a tradition that is genuinely meaningful, not just pageantry, not just performance, but a living connection to something ancient and serious about duty and service and the relationship between institutions and people. He understood why you don't break formation. He understood why the neutrality of the guard is important. He'd internalized all of it. And then, he met a situation where following the rule to its letter would have been a kind of violence. Where the man at the railing needed one thing and one thing only, to be seen by someone on the other side. And Thomas Ashworth was the someone on the other side. And he made a choice. Not because he was careless. Not because he didn't understand what he was doing. Because he understood exactly what he was doing, and did it anyway. I thought about Queen Camilla too. I want to be fair here, because it's easy, and lazy, to frame this as a story about a royal guard defying royalty, as if the two things are in opposition. As if what Ashworth did was a rebuke to the institution he serves. I'm not sure that's the honest reading. The honest reading, I think, is more uncomfortable than that. Because if someone did watch from that window, if someone did choose not to look away, then what Thomas Ashworth did wasn't defiance of the institution so much as a reminder of what the institution is supposed to be. At its best. When it's working. Service. Presence. The acknowledgement that people exist. Monarchy, stripped of all its pomp and its controversy and its enormous complicated history, is supposed to be, at its most basic, a presence. Someone who is there. Someone who, by virtue of their visibility and their permanence, makes the people in front of them feel acknowledged. That's a very old idea. It doesn't always work. It often fails in the hands of actual human beings who are as capable of distance and coldness as any of us. But it's the idea. And, on a cold Tuesday afternoon outside Buckingham Palace, a 26-year-old guard from Derbyshire lived that idea better than almost anyone is supposed to. In 4 minutes, through iron bars, without breaking military posture. I found out his name through Frank, eventually. Thomas Ashworth. Frank knew it from the rotation sheet he'd once glimpsed on a clipboard, and it's the kind of detail that sticks when you've been watching a place for 2 decades. I didn't try to contact him. I want to be clear about that. This story isn't mine to write up and publish with his name attached without his consent, and I'm telling it here with enough change that he remains protected. I hope he stays protected. I hope whatever door he possibly opened for that man with the grey temples stays open. I hope, if the man with the grey temples is reading this somehow, that something was different after that day. I have no way of knowing. But I hope. Frank finished his thermos as we stood there that second morning. He screwed the cap back on with the particular satisfaction of someone who does things properly and always has. Thing is, he said, gesturing toward the gate, people come here expecting. I don't know. Something grand. Something they can put in a photo. He looked at the guards standing in their boxes. But the real thing, the thing that actually matters, it's usually very small. And very quiet. And nobody gets a photo of it. He said goodbye and walked off toward the park with his thermos under his arm, and I stood there alone looking at the gate. The guards were still. The tourists were taking photos. A pigeon walked along the pavement in that self-important way pigeons have, as if they built the place and merely permit us to visit. And, somewhere in the city, a man with grey temples was carrying something in the inside pocket of his coat. Something small. Something passed through iron bars by a person who had no instruction to do it and every reason not to. Here's what I know about Thomas Ashworth, in the end. He's not famous. He's not going to be. The incident, if you can call 4 quiet minutes an incident, produced no footage that I've seen, no story in any paper, no hashtag. It existed exactly as long as it took to happen and, then, it passed, absorbed into the city, the way 10,000 small true things are absorbed every day into the enormous indifferent life of London. But, a man who had been shouting was not shouting anymore. And, a guard who was supposed to be a wall had, for a moment, chosen to be a person. And, somewhere, in some room, or in some corridor, or in the back of a dark Jaguar moving through those heavy gates, someone made a quiet inquiry. And, maybe that's how things actually change. Not in speeches. Not in headlines. In 4 minutes. In quiet words through bars. In the decision, made alone and, against instruction, to step forward instead of staying still. I left London 2 days later. Train from Paddington, early enough that the city was still in that half-light between night and morning, the streets wet from overnight rain, everything gleaming. I thought about him on the train. Not in a sentimental way. More in the way you think about something that has recalibrated you slightly. Adjusted the angle at which you're standing. Because we spend a lot of time, I do, at least believing that the things that matter require scale. That change needs to be dramatic. That to make a difference you have to make a noise. Thomas Ashworth made no noise. He took a step. He pressed a piece of paper through a gate. He went back to his post. And, the world, in some small corner of itself, was not quite the same as before. I think about the man with the grey temples sometimes. Whether he found whatever he was looking for. Whether his mother's story was eventually heard by someone who could do something with it. Whether the quiet inquiry led somewhere real or dissolved into bureaucracy the way these things so often do. I don't know. But, I know that on a Tuesday in late October, standing in the cold outside an iron gate, he stopped shouting. And, in a world where so many people are shouting and so few feel heard, that is not nothing. That, I think, is everything. There's a kind of courage that doesn't look like courage at all. It looks like one step forward, a low voice, and a hand through a set of bars. And, the whole world watches without understanding what it's seeing. Until later. When it's quiet. And, you finally, do.